And it's back to Mr. Venkateswaran, who was walking up to the stage. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to ISQ for inviting me to speak today on sustainability. It's a space that I've been working for the last 15 odd years, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. I have to say, in a community of quality people, I'm not a quality person in the sense that I know how important quality is, but I'm nowhere near as accomplished as all of you in terms of it. So I'm not going to speak too much to the quality side of it. I'm going to leave you to draw from what I say, how do we build quality into this? Because there's no question about the fact that sustainability doesn't work if there isn't a quality dimension. So that's just as a quick disclaimer and as something as food for thought as you listen to my presentation going forward. So the topic is tomorrow's company, sustainability at the center of business. And my basic proposition is that a company cannot survive tomorrow if sustainability is not at the core of its thinking. And what I'm going to try and do today in the next 20 odd minutes is to point to you some of the evidences that suggest that this proposition is indeed the case. And any company that ignores sustainability will do so at its peril. So let me start by not necessarily trying to define business sustainability, but very often when I speak to CEOs of companies and say, okay, what does sustainability mean to you? What does the term mean? For the longest time, they would say, yeah, my business has to be sustainable, which means that it must be profitable, it must grow, and it must live forever. That's the three dimensions that most CEOs would tell me about what sustainability means to them. And of course, they're right. I mean, there's no question of it. And then if you further break it down and if you say, okay, so what contributes to sustainability? It will be all these things that we are very familiar about. And note, quality is there. Not that I put it only for this particular presentation. It was always there because I do believe it is the case. So these are there. These are absolutely no question that you cannot have a company that's sustainable if it doesn't do all of these and does it very well. But to my mind, just doing this is yesterday's company. Just doing this cannot be the company of tomorrow. Why is that? Why do I say that? I'm just going to talk about a few things that are changing in the environment around us that have been changing for some time. All of you are familiar with this. So I'm not necessarily saying something new. I'm just trying to string it all together to make some sense out of it and to sort of give evidence to why I'm saying what I'm saying. If you just look at what are the basic risks that CEOs are seeing in the future in terms of their businesses. This is something that the WEF produces every year. It's called the Global Risk Report. This is the 2021 Global Risk Report. You'll see one very soon in the next WEF meeting. And what the question that they ask is essentially, what are the things that will impact your business? What are the big risks? And if you look at what's been happening over the years, you can see a very, very specific trend that there are more and more environmental and social issues that are beginning to impact the way a business success gets defined, how a business basically continues to do those three things: remain profitable, grow, and live, and obviously then live forever. So it's not just so this is known. We can see the trend, and you can see a lot more green stuff in that, a lot of the environment stuff. But as we know, living in a country like India, that there are a whole bunch of social stuff too that interact with these, and these are not silos. Environmental impacts, impact society and social impact environment. We know the interlinkages are there. So what are these? So as I said, I'm going to talk about 5. The first, of course, is the climate crisis. And we are sitting in the end of 2021, just about a month ago, there was the summit at Glasgow. Very little, unfortunately, was achieved in terms of what, at least from my perspective, but I think it underlined the fact that climate change is one of the biggest risks humanity faces going forward. And you know, we know what climate change is about. We know what it can do because in India we're facing it. We face it in terms of our cycles of floods and droughts. We face it in terms of just things like basic natural resources like water getting threatened in so many ways. And it's not just in India. We know it's across the globe. Ironically, in fact, in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was being signed, that's when we had the huge floods in Chennai. And it was actually quite, and at the same time, we had huge floods in Wales. And it just sort of illustrated the kind of havoc that climate plays on this. So for business, if you don't understand climate change and if you don't look at how you impact it and how it is impacted by you, you're not going to be there tomorrow. That's the clear message that climate change is telling us. So whether it's about mitigating our climate, the emissions, or adapting to what is inevitable about climate change, business continuity is absolutely at risk. Any plant that is located near the coast of India, if it is not starting to look at how sea level rise and storm surges are going to actually inundate its plant, they are going to miss a trick or two. So climate is a huge, huge risk, and it is very much central to our business continuity, and therefore for the future of business. The second, of course, is pollution. And again, we don't have to, I mean, those of you who are from Delhi, you don't have to know more about, I don't have to convince you anything about air pollution in Delhi. It's awful. Even today, it's awful. So in fact, we should have been wearing masks well before the pandemic came in. I think the pandemic just helped us to understand how much of a difference some of these masks make to us. But it's not just air pollution. It's water pollution. It's solid waste. It's all around us in different forms. And I think what we will understand, and I'll talk about this in a bit, is that a lot of businesses, a lot of manufacturing processes, this is an inevitability about a manufacturing process. It will cause pollution. Now the question therefore is, as a business, can I continue to do it without bothering, and not just saying I will meet the law, I will meet the regulation. That is increasingly not good enough because the regulation is not also going to be static, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But this is something huge. It's a huge problem of in all dimensions, and it is central to the way businesses run themselves and the way they will be impacted going forward. The third is the scarcity of natural resources. I love one slide that has been prepared by the American Chemical Society. It talks about the periodic table. But what it does is it takes each element and tries to predict how long this element is going to be available on Earth. And the number of elements in that, and some of them are crucial. Lithium, we keep talking about lithium as the lithium ion battery as a solution to a lot of our energy problems, is not going to be available 100 years from now. So you're going to have actually a periodic table which all of us were fascinated about when we were studying it in school chemistry, which is actually going to look very different because many of those elements will not exist actually on Earth. So we are using resources in a manner that is completely unsustainable. We are just using it up. Not only are we using resources like minerals and ores, we talked about water. Climate change just makes it worse, but we use water also in a very unsustainable manner. And we know of many companies, and I can certainly talk about Tata Coffee, for example, which in a few years ago, when I was there, we had to shut down the operations of the coffee plant because there was no water. It's that simple as that. There was no water available. We had to shut down operations. It happens to Grasshopper on a couple of occasions and many other. And this is going to be inevitably going to happen more and more often as climate change then impacts the kind of unsustainable use of water that we have. So natural resources, we are just going to run out of stuff. We are already using natural resources, even the renewable natural resources of water. We are consuming, by the end of July, we are consuming what we should have consumed by the end of December. There is something called the Earth Overshoot Day. You can Google that and it tells you how that's been changing. 25 years ago, we were, just as recent as 25 years ago, we were almost sustainable. We would not use it up in advance. Now we are in overdraft. We are using resources that 1.5 to 2 Earths can produce, but we're living on that one Earth. So, huge issue. Raw materials are going to be threatened by this. The fourth is the social inequality that we are living with. And I think pandemic just brought out what this inequality might look like. When we saw those migrant workers walking back and trying to get home to their villages. That's just one level of inequality, but we know all kinds of inequality that exist. Gender, caste, religion, all kinds of it. And I love the phrase that Mr. Sethi just said just before this presentation, of when you treat unequal people equally, you're just perpetuating this inequality. I think that's a lovely phrase. I'm going to use that, sir, with your permission. So I think this inequality is going to come to bite us, because in an unequal society, you can never have stability. And that's what is going to happen. Singur was an example of what something like that can happen. And I'm a Tata person, I'm using examples from there, and this is just one of them. There are many others that we could think about. So rising inequality, and just recently there was the World Inequality Report that was published. Please take a look at it and see how ridiculously unequal we are as a society in terms of just wealth ownership, and how that is actually getting worse. Oxfam, an organization that I happen to chair in India, we do an inequality report every year. And we actually demonstrated through data that the pandemic actually benefited the rich. Not only did it devastate the poor, it actually benefited the rich. That's because of the inequality of society. And when you live in that unequal society, there is no way business can continue to survive and thrive, and certainly not have longevity, because society itself is going to fail. How will business succeed in a society that is failing? The fifth sort of trend is the whole issue around informalization of the workforce. We know that for the last 2, 3, 4 decades, this whole outsourcing process has happened, and there are good reasons why it happens. But the way it has happened, and the kind of human rights violations that happen down the supply chain, are actually completely now people are beginning to understand. In the 90s and the early 2000s, all the brands like Levi Strauss, Gap, and so on had to completely change what was happening in their supply chains. Not because they felt, oh God, we are violating human rights. Because the customers have said, we're not going to buy your stuff if you're going to continue to do this. We do not want to buy sweatshop labor products. And that's the change that we are beginning to see over time. So what happens in our supply chains, we have almost no visibility of what's happening beyond the tier 1 supplier. We do not know what's happening in tier 2. We certainly do not know what's happening in tier 3. We used to struggle with this in the Tata Group. The good thing that we managed to do in the Tata Group was we actually started getting our companies to agree to KPIs of trying to say, we need to look at tier 2 and start looking at tier 3 very seriously. Otherwise, this whole issue is going to come back and bite us. And that's essentially what happened in the pandemic when you didn't worry about this. So these are the 5 sort of trends that are very, very important and will sort of impact business success going forward. But the trends, you could argue, so, what if I don't do anything about it? Who's going to catch me? Well, there are people who are going to catch you. Who are they? These are the stakeholders. So in the old Milton Friedman formulation, all we needed to do was to worry about our investors, because that's what it is. But we know that's changed. That's changed dramatically. The US Roundtable in 2019, the US Roundtable is a gathering of the who's who of US business at the CEO level. They completely turned around the proposition of what is the purpose of the business. From the Milton Friedman formulation of saying we are only accountable to our shareholders, to saying we need to be accountable to our stakeholders. We need to worry about what our customers are saying. We need to worry about what our supply chain partners are saying. So there is a complete change in the way business is looking at itself and who it is accountable and responsible to. It's no longer only the investors. And Larry Fink, who's the CEO of the largest investing company in the world, every year sends a letter to all its CEOs, and it tells the CEOs, you have to be transparent about what you're doing, you have to be strategic about sustainability and climate change, you have to be thinking about your stakeholders. And the information, what he's saying, his message is very clear. If you don't, we are pulling out our investment. What happened to Exxon? Exxon had to start reporting on climate change. They were refusing to do it because the investor said, if you don't, we are pulling out our investment. So investors are also asking these questions. So even if you believe that Milton Friedman is still right, that you're only worried about investors are asking these questions. About $40 to $50 trillion of investments are now going into thinking around ESG, thinking around sustainability, and they're asking their investee companies, what are you doing about it? Not out of, again, let me assure you, it's not out of sheer goodness of heart, okay? Because investors have two emotions that guide them, and this was told to me by an investor. He says, we are guided by two emotions. We are guided by fear, and we are guided by greed. Both these emotions play over here. The risk of their investments going down, that fear is huge. And sustainability and not following sustainability principles in the way you run your business is a huge risk for investors. So that's why this $40 trillion is going to companies that are showing some amount of commitment and actual practice of building sustainability and incorporating it into their business. So any business of tomorrow that wishes to start raising capital and is going to think that I don't have to worry about sustainability has to have another thing coming. Investors are thinking differently, acting differently, and asking companies to behave differently. Regulators too are doing the same. You have in India, for example, the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. I was privileged to be part of the committee that put that together. Coming out of that was a Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, the BRSR, which the SEBI has now mandated for the top 1,000 listed companies from the next FY. So all this is happening. Governments are getting more and more conscious about this. If you look at the kind of laws, extended producer responsibility, looking at e-waste, looking at plastic waste. So the waste pollution issue that I spoke about is not just something that's dangling in the air. Its regulations are going to push companies to start thinking about this and doing it more seriously. It's core business. It's not a nice thing to do. It is about survival. It is about growth. So regulations are going to push this more and more and more. Consumers and employees, basically, and growing evidence even in India, that consumers and employees prefer to deal with companies that have a purpose, that demonstrate a purpose. For us in the Tata Group, it was a very easy thing. We could see that. The Tatas have never been highest pay masters, but we always cared. And we know, and I can tell you from a personal experience of so many people that a lot of people stay in the group just because of who we are and that we care. And we demonstrate in almost on a daily basis how we care about society, how we care about the environment. And this is just not us. There are global surveys that are showing this, that employees prefer to join and stay with companies that care. Customers, I talked about what happened with the Nikes and the Levi's, what happened to Shell. I mean, there are, again, examples globally about how customers are saying, we don't want to do it. And if you think customers are only the retail customers, think again. Customers, for example, Unilever. If you are a supplier to Unilever and you do not follow sustainability principles, you are not going to get that work anymore, because Unilever is going to insist that all my suppliers conform to sustainability. Tata Chemicals is one of the suppliers to Unilever, and they remain a preferred supplier because they embedded sustainability early in 2000 into the way they run their business. So business, your customer acquisition, your ability to stay with customers is increasingly going to be defined by how you do this and how you do this well. And finally, of course, communities. It's no longer that you can just displace communities or not worry about what happens to communities, pollute the water, and just get away with it. That's not going to happen. And if you need evidence from India, ask Coca-Cola. Their plant in Plachimada in Kerala has been shut for 20 years because the panchayat said, you're using up our drinking water, we're not going to allow you to operate, we're going to shut down your plant. That's it. The plant is shut. And there are multiple examples of where this disruption happens every now and then. So the license to operate is no longer is given to a company by the government, it's given by communities. And therefore, you need to understand and be conscious of how the company is looking at pollution, never mind whether you're within the regulation, how you're looking at inequality, how you're looking at all of these things. Because these stakeholders are pushing businesses to say, you need to think differently about the way you run your business, otherwise you're going to be out of business. So, what will tomorrow's company look like? And I'm going to end with just a few slides trying to summarize all of this. So one of the things is, let's go back to this sort of graphic I showed you earlier. This is yesterday's company. And if you look at all the things we just spoke about in the last 15 minutes, all of these are beginning to impact these same parameters of growth, profitability, and longevity. Human rights issues, inequality, climate change, all of these are going to impact the future of business. So tomorrow's company is the one that actually thinks, understands that its growth, profitability, and longevity, the three still important things that drive a company, are no longer just driven by the things in black that you see on this graphic, but also by the things in red. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be there tomorrow. That's one of the takeaways at a very high level. But let me just tell you what companies are doing, therefore, in response to these things. One is they're setting a whole bunch of targets. And these are just some examples of what companies are setting targets for themselves on issues that matter. So, for example, in climate, how they're going to deal with climate, the use of renewables, what they're going to do with emissions, the kind of material they're going to start using on resource use, how they deal with waste, how they deal with any of how do they recycle stuff. All of these companies are setting targets so that they can get there. They're not saying, we will do this. They are saying, by 2025, we're going to do this. By 2030, we're going to do this. It's that serious in leading companies that you can see over here. The whole concept of circular thinking is now again getting more and more embedded. And circular thinking is a very interesting idea because one and only one aspect of circular thinking is recycling. Because everybody thinks it's only about recycling. It's not just about recycling. It starts with how you design your product for recycling. Because one of the problems with many products is that you don't design it for easy disassembly after use, end of life use. And if it is very hard to disassemble it at the end of life, it is very unlikely that you'll be able to recycle the stuff in there. So a Jaguar car is sort of designed that you can disassemble it and separate out the parts, because all the plastics, for example, are color-coded in 2 hours. If you have the right tools, in 2 hours you can disassemble it. It's designed to be that, so that you can start using, you can take the aluminum and start using it. Of course, one of the things it does is moving to aluminum, because aluminum is the most recyclable metal. Mind you, part of the Tata Group, Tata Steel produces steel, but they are saying, okay, you may produce steel, but we're going to buy aluminum. And one of their suppliers is Novalis, which is an Aditya Birla company. And that's just as an aside, because they are embedded to sustainability. So circular thinking starts from the design. Circular thinking is about also saying, at the end of the day, I don't have to, the only way I recycle, say, a metal is not after that I melt it and then start it again, because that also uses up energy and emission. You try and reduce the amount of energy you consume. So Tata Motors, for example, and I'm giving you a lot of Tata examples because that's the group I know best. Their whole engine reconditioning plant, engine reconditioning is a classic example of trying to do recycling, not at the end of it by melting it, but by saying all the embedded energy and carbon that's gone into producing a cylinder block, we can just recondition it and use it. Caterpillar does that in a huge way. And when they were getting customers saying, you're giving us second-hand stuff, Caterpillar said, okay, you don't have to buy my stuff. I will lease you this equipment. You can use it whenever you want. I will lease it to you. I will own it. I will maintain it. I will run it. So that it could embed the whole circular process into the way it operates. So circular thinking is happening. Supply chains, I talked about what happens in supply chains. And all of these companies are committed to looking at human rights issues, looking at what happens in the environment in the supply chains, right down to the base. So building sustainability thinking, policies, action in the supply chain, and ensuring that the suppliers actually benefit when they do it, and if there are consequences of not being conforming to those qualities, is part of what all these companies are doing. The issue around addressing inequality within and without is again something that you will find leading companies beginning to do, and tomorrow's company is one that will think about it, understand it, and address it. It will align itself to the Sustainable Development Goals. Figure out which of those goals are relevant. So there are 17 goals, 169 targets. Not all of it is relevant for every company. It's about thinking about where these impact you and where you impact them. And so tomorrow's company is one that will align itself more and more. And mind you, there are publications that demonstrate that by actually aligning with these goals, you can actually create new businesses. So there is a whole piece of study on this, and I don't have the time to take you, but happy to chat about this after this. So aligning, tomorrow's company will align itself to these SDGs. It will mainstream sustainability into the core business strategy. It's no longer an aside. It's no longer a side thing. Tomorrow's company knows that when you're thinking about business strategy, sustainability has to be part of it. It's core. It's not, it's central. It's the way you think about strategy. It will disclose more. And there are more and more global frameworks that are available to companies to disclose what they want to do. To say that, look, we're not just, it's not just a PR exercise. Here's our report, open to scrutiny, come and take a look. And more companies are doing that. More and more investors are demanding that. And in fact, as I said, that's what Larry Fink says. You have to disclose more. You have to tell us, not just talk about what you're doing, tell us what you're doing and what is the thinking and what is the strategy behind it. So tomorrow's company is essentially going to do that. So I'm going to stop there and just say that, you know, this is no longer an option. It's absolutely central for survival. And if you want to be tomorrow's company, I don't think you have a choice. And it's better to do something strategically because you know it's going to happen and put it into your strategy than to be forced into doing it. It's the equivalent of sort of saying, let me build an engine that doesn't emit rather than putting a catalytic converter at the end, because it's never going to be a good solution. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Happy to take any questions or listen to any comments from all of you. Thank you.
Sarika, can you take up questions
I think we have time left for only one direct question from the audience.
Okay, fine.
Thank you, Mr. Shankar, for your this wonderful presentation. And you touched about the inequality in the Indian society. My question is regarding to the global inequality, and particularly in view of the COP26 at Glasgow, and India has raised some concern there. How India is going to cope with that, and particularly the use of coal for the electric generation, in view of the electric mobility, which country is looking for in coming years?
Yeah, it is a big challenge for us, which is why we didn't sign up to that that one on coal, where we about getting rid of coal. See, I think let's try and look at climate change in perspective from an Indian standpoint. We are going to be huge victims of climate change. Let's not kid ourselves about it. We are going to be impacted more than the Western world, I can tell you that. Because if you just look at warming as one of the impacts of climate change, we are a tropical country. Parts of our country can grow 2 crops. The southern part of the country will start desertifying if climate change continues the way it is. And we will be reduced to a 1-crop economy. And you can imagine what that will do to our food security. Look at what will happen to Europe. Europe is temperate, 1 crop. It will become tropical, 2 crops. They are going to grow the food for the world, and we are back to begging for food. So if anybody says, we shouldn't worry about it because we didn't cause climate change, which is true, but we have to be realistic and say we are going to suffer the most because of climate change. So it is in our interest to do something about climate change. So I think it's very important to sort of understand that, because I think it's very easy to think of it as a Western plot. Of course there is. I mean, there is no question about the fact that the developed world has to do far more than it is doing. There's no question. And they're trying to get away with it. They're literally getting away with murder for the longest time. If you look at the latest attempt to take climate change into the Security Council, which we opposed, that is again another ploy of trying to push the developing world into this. So I think the geopolitics are very clear, but we have to come from our own, what is in our interest. It is in our interest. It is no point in saying you do first, hum baad mein karenge. I think it is in our interest that everybody starts doing it, and we have to find ways for that to happen. For us, the coal transition is a very important one, not only because of fuel security. It is very important because there is a huge social impact of getting out of coal, which very few people talk about. You have millions of not only people who work in the coal mines, but all the allied, which is 5 times the number of people who work in coal mines, whose lives will get impacted if coal goes away. Okay, so it is not in our short-term interest to get rid of coal, and that's the position we're taking, and we must take. But we still need to push the agenda on climate change, not only for ourselves. We need to say that we are serious, and therefore you need to be more serious. That's the messaging that we have to do. That's the sort of negotiation that we need to do. And I think to some extent we are being able to do that. But I don't think we are going to get out of coal very soon. We can't get out of coal very soon because of not just the fact that it will provide us an energy security, but I think there are huge social impacts of getting out of coal in a hurry. But inevitably, it will have to go. There is no choice. We will have to inevitably get out of fossil fuel, whether it is in electricity production or in automobiles. No options. It's just about timing it, and the sooner we do it, the better. But we obviously need to get the Western world to sort of do it and do the needful, including providing technology and finance before we commit ourselves to that. So to me, it's a negotiating ploy. It's not the reality. We have to get out of it.
Thank you, Mr. Shankar.
Yes, please. I think the organizer said one question, so I don't know. I'm being liberal about it. I'm happy to take a question.
Thanks for an excellent sharing, Mr. Venkataraman. I'm J. Ravikant from SRF. You talked about the responsibility that India should have, regardless of whether Europe has a certain agenda or not. Similarly, the large companies willy-nilly will get down to do it, right? But in the Pareto, if you look at only the large companies, a very large number of smaller organizations, which is the MSMEs and so on, are not onto this agenda at all. It's not even in their thinking process anywhere. So maybe a quick answer. I know it's a tough one. What is your view on a couple of things that they could do to make it a more sustainable process?
Well, I think there's a lot more that the large companies should do, and which is why the supply chain point that I made is an important one. I think that large companies need to do more with the supply chains than they are doing. See, right now the conversation with the supplier is inevitably on three things. It's on price, it's on delivery, and it's on quality. Okay, it's never on things like human rights, sustainability in general. It's never that. That fourth item has to come into the discussion. It is a very difficult thing for an SME or especially an MSME, a micro, to change, because it requires investment. Okay, the investment pays back. There is no doubt about it. So energy efficiency pays back in anywhere from 1 to 2 years. The problem they have is access to capital, access to technology. That's where the large companies need to play. So the role of the large company is to support this transition of the MSMEs to be able to embrace this. And they have to be encouraging and supportive, not saying you do it, otherwise we're not going to buy from you. That's not going to be the way it will work. It'll have to be more proactive and more encouraging. So that's one aspect. I think that's a big role for large companies, especially with their supply chains. I think there is a huge policy issue that needs to happen, which is around how do we incentivize the cost of capital for MSMEs for making these transitions. That is a huge question. So, for example, you have priority sector lending as a requirement. How can we work with that? Because that's a tool that already exists to ensure that there is more low-cost funding that's available to MSMEs so that they can start making these transitions. So I think there are 3-4 sort of buttons that need to be pressed. But I think I started with the large companies because I think that's the important piece. In your supply chains, are you doing enough to support your supply chain to get into this mode of sustainability? And I think that if the conversation gets limited to those 3 elements, it's not going to happen. So the fourth element of sustainability has to be built into the conversation that procurement folk go. We spent a lot of time in the Tata Group actually speaking to procurement people and saying, how can we help you? What does sustainable procurement mean? Don't think of it as cost, think of it as investment, because that's really what it is. It pays back, so it is investment. So I think that conversation needs to be very different with our suppliers. Okay, since the organizer is not saying I should shut up, I'm happy to take another question. If there isn't a question, then that's fine. Okay, usually the one before lunch is always a tough one. Everyone is hungry, including me.
So. On growth, profitability, and longevity, but not with the traditional form, but include human rights, circular economy, etc. Building sustainability as a core strategy was well articulated, sir. Thank you so much for an interesting session. May I invite Uday to honor Mr. Shankar Venkateswaran.